And welcome to The Issue Is. I'm Elex Michaelson. Look at this panel. Two of the smartest guys that I know who dressed exactly the same.
You made us dress this way.
Yeah. Literally, these are the guys that teach me about politics, and so let's meet them. Dan Schnur worked on 4 presidential campaigns, 3 campaigns for governor, ran for office himself as a nonpartisan. He teaches politics at UC Berkeley, USC, and Pepperdine, and is one of my favorite professors of all time. Brian Goldsmith is a political analyst and consultant who has helped the likes of Pete Buttigieg. Before that, he was a journalist who produced Katie Couric's most consequential political interviews. Dan and Brian, welcome back to The Issue Is. Great to see both of you. A lot to talk about this week, and let's start by discussing the impact of crime in California and how it impacts politics here. This month, Vanity Fair has quite an article out. It's called, "Can Anyone Fix California?" And among the people they interviewed was former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who says this. Let's put it up on the screen. The biggest challenge to California, she says, is safety. She goes on to say, whether you want to call it homelessness or drug use or whatever it is, safety is the oath we take to protect and defend, yes, the Constitution, but the people. Speaking of safety, this week, Manson follower Leslie Van Houten left prison on parole for her role in a murder more than a century ago. Governor Newsom okayed that release. And then there was this, Democrats in the Assembly's Public Safety Committee stopping a bill that would have made sure that people convicted of child sex trafficking could not get out early. The bill had originally passed the state Senate unanimously. There was such a brouhaha after this, Governor Newsom actually intervened to bring the bill back. Eventually, they got this thing through, but it was ugly and not great politics. Dan, let's start with you. Is this a vulnerable issue for Democrats? And is Nancy Pelosi framing this right when she says it's about safety?
Well, not surprisingly, Pelosi is framing this right. And she's worked in politics long enough to remember lessons from the past. And she can remember, as can I, as can most of us, that for most of the late 20th century, Republicans used the criminal justice and public safety issue debate here in California and elsewhere essentially as a tiebreaker in statewide elections. And through the 80s and 90s, this was the issue that they used as a wedge against Democrats. Now, as we find out so often, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And just as after Democrats had been perceived as being weak on crime in the 1960s and 70s, Republicans benefited from the overcorrection. We've now seen over the last couple of decades here, Democrats in California pursuing a much less aggressive stance on criminal justice. Because crime has dropped so much in California, that hasn't really hurt them over the years. But now the crime rates are going up again. It is a challenge. And Pelosi is smart enough and has been around long enough to remember what's happened in the past and to begin these efforts to reframe.
Of course, you're talking about your old boss, Pete Wilson, who was governor at the time, and there were a lot of Democrats who thought that he went too far, which has led to so much Democratic success over the years at the polls. Now you have, frankly, a farther left Democratic Party who has strong views about criminal justice reform, and you're seeing that right now.
Well, that's exactly right. Crime really came roaring back as an issue this decade. It cost the Democratic Party probably 12 to 14 House seats in 2020. It cost the Democrats the House itself in the 22 cycle, especially in 2 big blue states, California and New York. There are about a dozen Biden districts that are now represented by Republican members of Congress, and that alone is more than double Kevin McCarthy's margin. So Democrats have got to go right at this issue. They've got to fix this issue. And anytime the word or phrase child sex trafficking is anywhere near the Democratic Party, that is a big problem.
Yeah, and meanwhile, it's interesting to see what Governor Newsom did on this. Here's what he said after this thing was essentially yanked. He backed the Republican, Shannon Grove, over Democrats. Take a listen.
I talked to Senator Grove about it this morning, which is indicative of my desire to see what we can do.
We know that he reads the tea leaves. He may have aspirations of something else. I don't know. What do you make of the way he handled this whole thing?
Well, it's worth remembering that when Gavin Newsom got his start in politics back in San Francisco, way back in the day, one of his signature issues then was taking on the homelessness issue very aggressively against the more progressive wing of the San Francisco Democratic Party, which is a fairly progressive wing. By the same token, he recognizes here that crime is an issue that can hurt Democrats. Going back to your previous point, Alex, Republicans are never going to be the majority party in California again until they decide to reassess their positions on immigration and on abortion rights. But Newsom, like Pelosi, recognizes that crime is an issue that could really hurt the Democrats. And this committee, which earlier this year actually voted to determine that sexual violence was not a violent crime in California, Newsom understands he can't leave his flank exposed on this, which is why he's pushing back so hard.
Yeah.
I would say that Joe Biden in the last presidential cycle took a lot of crap from my fellow Democrats for having been the author behind the 1994 crime bill. But that liability has turned, I think, into a big strength. Once again, Joe Biden is actually right in the sweet spot, the center of where American politics is and where the voters are. And his anti-crime credentials are kind of coming back to the fore in a very helpful way.
Let's talk about another big issue this week, which is what's happening with organized labor in California. I think we could call this the summer of strikes, right? We got the actor strike, we got the writer strike, we have the hotel workers strike, we got UPS workers on strike, we got the SEIU on strike. Everybody's on strike. There's a strike for everybody. What's going on here? Why are there so many strikes happening at the same time? What's happening with organized labor?
Well, I've heard it called hot liberal summer, and the driver behind it is an economic driver, which is that a middle-class job is no longer providing middle-class life, particularly in places like LA and San Francisco. The cost of housing, in particular, is making it just unaffordable for people to be able to live decently, even and especially if they're working full-time. And so labor's pushing back to try to use the tight market to drive more earning power for their members.
Is this effective, and is it a chance that it could backfire on them?
Well, it has the potential to be more effective this year than under most circumstances. First of all, going back to our conversation about Biden, well, Biden has maintained a very strict centrist course on criminal justice and public safety issues. He's arguably the most pro-labor president that we've seen in the modern era. In organized labor and their leaders understand that they have a real ally in the White House. Here in California, given the deep blue makeup of state government, they also know that they have very loyal allies in the legislature, in the governor's office. But one other thing that's going on here, Alex, which I think does help them, is think of this as the post-COVID season of strikes. A lot of these men and women were essential workers during the shutdown. And that allowed them to gain a level of public sympathy, but it also gave them a political opportunity as COVID is eased to come back and say, we were there for you. Now we want our share too.
Yeah, you think it's going to work?
We'll see.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think the three words you're not supposed to say on television, I don't know.
Right.
But I think, particularly in the entertainment industry, this combination of writers and actors, that necessarily causes a lot of pressure.
Yeah. All right. Meanwhile, pretty good week for President Biden. If you look at what happened, the president met with NATO, which he really has helped to keep together and unified during Russia's assault on Ukraine. Meanwhile, the rise of inflation is easing, now headed down to 3%, down from 9%, which has been one of his biggest liabilities. Still, a majority of the country disapproves of the job he's doing. 42% approval, 53% disapproval. A majority still worried about his age. This in The Atlantic, Elliot Cohen writing this: step aside, Joe Biden. The president has no business running for office at 80. And Dan, isn't this a legitimate concern? I mean, is it a good idea to have a president in his mid-80s?
Well, I think what most Americans have decided is that it's not a good idea, but they're going to make that decision in the context of a comparison. Old joke about the two guys on the camping trip. A bear shows up. One of the guys starts to lace on his sneakers. His friend says, "What are you putting on sneakers for? You can't outrun that bear." And the guy says, "Yeah, but I can outrun you." That is essentially the Biden strategy against Trump. Make no mistake about it, Alex. Joe Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump, but Donald Trump might be the only Republican who Joe Biden can beat. Because in the context of that comparison, Biden knows, he goes, I don't have to be perfect. I just have to be better than him.
But isn't this something, Brian, that Democrats behind the scenes, who all are unified and say everything great about Joe, are whispering behind the scenes, man, he's looking pretty old. I'm concerned. We're throwing a lot behind this guy. Kamala Harris, I don't know about her. This is a giant risk.
I'm not disagreeing with any of that, and it's not whispering.
Yeah.
It's a legitimate question. I mean, Joe Biden acknowledges that it's a legitimate question. I think it has been helpful that his answer to that question has moved from watch me to with age comes wisdom and experience and the ability to be effective. I think we saw that just this week. I don't know of any other president, Democrat or Republican, who could have kind of moved the chess pieces in a way to persuade the Turks to get the Swedes into NATO, to expand NATO, to push back against Russia. Domestically, you look at his record, every other president, Democrats and Republicans, has not lived up to what Biden has achieved, probably since LBJ. So I think he has an answer to the question, but he's going to have to answer it over and over.
Do you really believe what you just said, which is that,
Yes,
that Trump Biden may be the only Democrat that can beat Trump? Do you not think that Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg or Wes Moore or somebody else in the Democratic bench could beat Donald Trump?
What I should say is that Joe Biden would have the best chance of any Democrat of beating Donald Trump, because if you look at the difference between 2016 and 2020, Joe Biden was able to reach out to those working class voters in Rust Belt America and convince them to abandon Trump for his candidacy in a way that Hillary Clinton couldn't. And I think it's an open question whether any of the Democrats you mentioned have that same skill set. But what makes this even a greater challenge for Biden, Alex, and it's worth spending just a moment on, is the discomfort that many Democratic leaders have about Vice President Harris. Now, Biden is clearly running for re-election. He's made that announcement. He believes his health is sufficient. But keep this in mind. If he were to withdraw from the race in December, you would see a very competitive multi-candidate primary, the survivor of which would go on to be a very competitive general election candidate. If he withdraws next March or April, then Vice President Harris becomes the Democratic nominee. So I suggest to you that Joe Biden really has about 6 months to decide whether he's running for re-election or not. And that can't be an easy decision because he and his advisors understand the stakes involved of what happens if he steps down too late.
Well, and at that age, health could be an issue at any point.
Precisely.
Right, including when you're talking about. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about the Republicans. President Trump really seems to be going his own way, so not following the crowd. His numbers continue to rise. Can anybody beat him? We'll talk about that and more. You're watching The Issue Is.
Do you really believe what you said? What a great way to
Here is the latest Real Clear Politics average of polls among Republican voters nationwide. Donald Trump with 53% support. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis with 21%. Former VP Mike Pence at 6%. Trump slamming DeSantis in Iowa.
He's got no personality. You probably found that out because his polls are crashing.
Back with our panel, political analysts Brian Goldsmith and Dan Schnur. Their polls are rising. So what's going on? Why is Trump just seem to be so dominant right now?
Well, he's the former president. You know, he has a very favorable view among Republican voters. You would expect him to be quite dominant. I'm a little bit contrarian on this. I think the national polls don't matter until after Iowa and New Hampshire. I think the whole campaign boils down to, can somebody beat Trump? Presumably, hopefully, the same person, because I'm rooting for Trump to lose in Iowa and New Hampshire. And then it's a real race. But if Trump wins those two states, it's over. He's the nominee.
But right now, the polls in both Iowa and New Hampshire show Trump up huge.
Well, so, Alex, it's going to sound like I'm changing the subject, but I'm not. Years and years ago, the former basketball player Dennis Rodman once said, he said, quote, "The only bad press is an obituary." And to me, that sums up Donald Trump's approach to politics.
And his approach to his life, right?
Which is, he knows that he would rather, and he wrote about this in Art of the Deal, he would rather achieve unfavorable coverage than no coverage, because at least then he can dominate the conversation. And in the Republican primary, he's dominating the conversation to a degree that no other candidate has a chance to be heard. And one or more of them, other than Chris Christie, are going to have to figure out how harsh they're willing to go after him in order to get into that
But
conversation.
isn't there also something to the point that I know you disagree with Donald Trump, but he's pretty good at this, right? I mean, he's got an enormous personality. He projects strength, although I know some Democrats dispute that. But he does. Among Republicans, he projects strength.
I agree
He
with
looks like the biggest guy on the stage, not only physically, but don't you think there's something to that?
I think there's a risk in overlearning the lesson of the past, both for Biden and for Trump. Because Trump won in a kind of fluke in 2016, he drew an inside straight, having lost the popular vote by a lot. People ascribe all this like magic to Trump that isn't necessarily there because he led his party to defeat in 18, 20, and 22. And I think for Biden, his answer is always, well, I won in 20 and you didn't. But, you know, he almost lost the nomination in 20, and he came within about 50,000 votes of losing the Electoral College in 20. So I think both these guys would, you know, if I could humbly suggest, have stuff to work on. And Trump has shown no capacity, zero, to grow beyond what he's always been.
So Ron DeSantis was thought of by many as like the hope to take him on, and his launch hasn't been especially exciting for a lot of folks. What do you make of him, and why are his numbers not better?
I think DeSantis is making the same mistake that lots of big state governors make when they run for president, is they assume they can essentially run the same kind of campaign they ran in a large state on a national stage. And this is exactly what DeSantis is doing here. He's trying to run for the president of Florida. And in 49 other states, the voters don't find that to be nearly as enticing a message. What I would say is it's worth remembering that most of the other Republicans, until it was too late in 2016, most of the other Republicans laid off of Donald Trump because they wanted to be the last person standing other than him. So he never really had to fight a contested primary. And I would argue that if one or more of those candidates step forward, like I was saying earlier, I think you do see a contested race. As DeSantis flounders, to keep an eye on Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina. He's starting to attract more money. He's starting to attract more grassroots support in Iowa and New Hampshire. And if the maybe Trumpers in the Republican Party are looking for an alternative, he might be a little bit easier to bear than DeSantis has been so far.
Probably would be the front runner to be Trump's VP at this point, too, potentially, if that happens. Who knows? So the next big thing in the race is going to be this debate that's supposed to happen for Republicans. It's going to be on Fox News Channel. DeSantis says he's in. Pence says he's in. Trump says, I don't know. We saw what happened the last time he did the first debate on Fox. We're looking at some video of that right now. That was quite a thing. He talked about Rosie O'Donnell, got into it with Megyn Kelly, got a lot of attention, ended up as the nominee. If you were advising Trump, because you advise candidates, would you tell him go on that debate stage?
No, but I think he will anyway. He's the dominant front runner. I don't think he has to start debating at this point. He doesn't have room to grow, really. He has room to shrink. And why start the shrinking process earlier than you have to? He'd get a little bit of flack for not debating, but I think in August the voters aren't really tuned in. He could probably wait to start debating until September, October.
Alex, there's no possible way that Donald Trump is going to be on that debate stage in August. And that was sealed earlier this week when former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who's been very virulent, who's been very combative in his attacks on Trump, passed the donor threshold. Christie has now received donations from 40,000 donors, which qualifies him for that debate. If Donald Trump was thinking about going, the last thing he wants is the Tony Soprano of Republican politics coming after him.
And I'm one of those
Trump's
donors,
gonna
by
stay
the way.
Which away.
Which shows you why.
You donated to him as a Democrat. You donated
As a
to Chris
Democrat,
Christie.
because I wanted him up on. I want him on that wall. I need him on that wall. But he's not going to be the nominee because he's attracting donations from somebody like me.
Like I said, he's the Soprano of the field. He can be a hit man for another candidate. He probably doesn't come through on his own.
But does he sign the piece of paper that says he's going to support the Republican nominee? I bet he doesn't.
What Christie has said is he said, I'll do the same thing that Trump did in 2016. I'll sign it, and then I'll think as I go forward whether I want to abide by it or not.
Does that work? I don't know.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, speaking of TV shows, Sopranos, of course, one of the great shows of all time.
Absolutely.
This week, the Emmy nominations came out. We hope they'll be in Emmys with the strikes and everything else. But I'm curious for your take, best TV show right now.
Well, I would say two. One is Succession.
Yes.
Maybe the greatest show I've ever watched. But I also thought the last season of Mrs. Maisel was extraordinary. And you know, the way that it flashed back and flashed forward to different periods, different decades, focused on the relationship between the kind of the celebrity comedian and her manager. I thought it was really sharp.
What about you?
So all sorts of talk about Succession, about Mrs. Maisel, about Barry, even about Ted Lasso, which I think fell off a little bit this year,
Yeah.
although for the record, I want to grow up and be Roy Kent. The sleeper this year was Shrinking.
Oh, so good.
Jason Segel, Jessica Williams, and best of all, Harrison
Ford.
When I was a kid, I wanted to be Han Solo in Indiana Jones. Now I want to be that grouchy, curmudgeonly Harrison Ford character.
You're on your way.
He's my idol.
I just want to see you as Roy Kent. That sounds interesting. All right. I mean, honorable mention for Better Call Saul, which I think was outrageously great this year, but Succession. And the third episode of Succession this season was not only the best episode of TV this year, but one of the great TV shows of all time.
And of course, the issue is.
Well, yeah, there we go. It's not best this year. That's okay. Succession led the pack with 27 nominations. We appreciate you both for coming in. We go to break with the theme song from Succession. We'll be right back. Doesn't this put you in a mood?
It does.
I mean, it's really something. Yeah.
That makes you want to yell, "Don't skip it!"